Welcome back. This is Lecture 2, Part 1. Now we begin to get into some of the meat of the New Testament. We've spent our first lecture going through setting up how we would approach the Scriptures, how we begin to understand the Old Testament, the New Testament. And since this is a class on the New Testament, I want to draw your attention now to the first issue, and that will be looking at the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels. And here's what I want to draw your attention to as a theme. Okay? Now, the word synoptic, it means seen together. Seen together. That's what the word means, synoptic. Okay? Each gospel was likely written for a different community of faith at a different time and location to bring the gospel witness to bear on the needs of that particular community. I want you to understand this is how we're going to approach this particular segment of it. Okay? So the synoptic means seen together. That's what it means, right? Right? So each gospel was likely written for a different community of faith at a different time and location to bring the gospel witness to bear on the needs of that particular community. This is really crucial that you understand this, and this is how we're going to approach it. And just try to follow my thought for a moment with me. Okay? If you were in many years ago, my daughter was involved in a car accident. This is many years ago now. Let's see, my daughter's about 37 now. So she had to have been somewhere around 18 or 19 years of age at the time. So it is a long time ago. And in this car accident, she was going through an intersection. So I want you to picture, get a picture in your mind here, because this becomes crucial to understanding how we approach the Gospels. So if you were to draw a cross, a parallel cross, right? So we draw a line, and then we draw another line, okay? So we at a major intersection. You have the street going north and south. You got the street going east and west, right? And when you get to this accident scene, and we arrived at a time we had received the phone call. This has got to be 20 years ago, something like that. And we arrived at the scene, and when you get to the scene, it happens that this is a very busy intersection. And at this intersection, there were literally people on four corners. Right? So there were people on the northwest corner. Right? There were people on the southeast corner. There were people in the northeast corner. There were people on the southwest corner. So in any given moment, you're seeing traffic going north and south. You're seeing traffic going east and west, depending on your perspective. Remember, you're at the corner. Okay? You're going to see that accident take place from your vantage point. So the persons who testified at the accident, they testify, those who were sitting in the southeast corner, they said they saw the traffic signal this way, they saw the traffic doing certain things this way, and the two vehicles doing something here. As opposed to the person who was sitting on the north corner, looking south, they saw it from a different perspective. Then the person sitting from the southwest corner, okay, they saw it from a different perspective, and the people sitting in the northwest corner saw it from a different perspective. So you have four perspectives quite distinct from one another. You get to a court hearing, and in the court hearing, it was clear that we have four witnesses, multitude of witnesses, four witnesses who gave a different version of what they saw. So now, here's where it drives us crazy. Somebody is lying. Not everybody could be telling the truth. That is in fact the prevailing wisdom of the day. The truth of the matter is that if you listen to all four perspectives, no one was lying. It's just what they saw from their perspective. But it sounded contradictory. Well, you see, you need to understand that you cannot ask a person sitting in the southwest corner to give testimony as if they were in the northeast corner. Right? You cannot ask somebody who's in the northeast corner to give testimony as someone who's in the southwest corner, or the northwest corner and the southeast corner, and vice versa. Do you follow what I'm saying to you? Even the people on the southern end of the street, on the southeast and southwest corner, saw different things. As well as the people from the northwest corner and the northeast corner, they saw different things. So it's not that someone was lying or somebody was confused. It's from the perspective that they saw it from the corner of their eye at that moment in brief seconds of what they saw. And they can only testify to what they saw, what they heard, what they perceived then. It's in the questioning answering period between the prosecutors and the attorneys and so forth like that, that they get involved in trying to ferret out, okay, what they think that person perceived as opposed to what they actually saw. Do you understand that? You understand that concept? Well, the Gospels is the same way. The Gospel has 4 different distinct perspectives on the same message of God. Do you understand that? And so synoptic, what we call the synoptic Gospels, is it means seen together, seen together. Follow me? You have Matthew, you have Mark, you have Luke, and you have John. So each gospel was likely written for a different community of faith at a different time and location to bring the gospel witness to bear on the needs of that particular community. So you're going to have different versions of the same incidents, and that's what I want to draw your attention to. Now, what is the shape of the gospel story? Right? The synoptic gospels. Right? The Gospels of the New Testament tell us about the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's literally what it tells us. Right? They tell us about Jesus' birth. They tell us about his teachings. They tell us about Jesus' miracles. They tell us about Jesus' journeys. They tell us about Jesus' struggles. They tell us about the confrontations with the religious leaders, as well as about all of his suffering, his execution, and the appearances after his resurrection. So we get a lot of information, which by itself is overwhelming, and then we get it from 4 different perspectives. Remember the 4 corners? And so people sit there going, why are they confused? They're not confused. It's 4 distinct perspectives. Since the story is so familiar to many, it's easy to assume that the gospel all tell the same story in the same way, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is not true. It is true that they are telling the same story, but the way they tell it is considerably different, just like those 4 corners in that testimony of that accident at the intersection. A closer examination of the gospel reveals that each of the gospels was written in a particular style with a great deal of freedom in what was selected to include or exclude and how it was included in his, okay, and how and what is included is presented. Now, the first 3 gospels, we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Right? Traditionally, they've been set apart from the 4th gospel, which would be the Gospel of John. Now, there's a reason for that. Just hang on. So, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they share more with each other in terms of material and arrangement of the material that they share with than or as opposed to the Gospel of John. It is in this general similarity between the first 3 Gospels, even in light of their differences, that has given them the name synoptic Gospels. So the synoptic Gospels is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those traditionally are the other ones. I know that everybody pretty much throws in the book of John. I understand why they do it. But the reason is because these 3 tend to share the same material of the same incidents that took place. So, what we have is the content and the structure of John's gospel is so different from these 3 that it is usually studied separately from the synoptic gospels. And we'll understand that a little bit later when we get into the introduction of the Gospel of John. We'll do that later. Now, after a careful examination of the organization of the Synoptic Gospels reveals that even though they follow a similar structure of events compared to John, because that's really the measuring stick, right? There are differences, sometimes substantial differences, in the order in which the material is placed. For example, if we were to take the first 5 chapters of the book of Mark as an example, contain material that is also recounted in the book of Matthew and Luke. Now, while Luke roughly follows the order of Mark and Matthew, okay, organizes the material in a significantly different ways. So let's do a grid, okay? We're going to do a grid, right? And what we're going to do is do 3 columns, right? We're going to do 3 columns. And look at your handout. It's in your handout. So we're going to do 3 columns. And then on the top of the column for each heading, we're going to put Mark, Matthew, and Luke. We're together? And then we're going to do 8 columns down. Follow me? So we'll go Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then on the top put Synoptic Gospels, okay? And then we're going to do 8 columns down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay? And what I want you to do is write these scriptures in there. Write these scriptures in there. Because this is how, because when you study it out, you'll see what I'm talking about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke in the 3 Gospels. Okay, here we go. So under Mark, column number 1, write Mark 1, verse 21 to 45. Under Matthew, write Matthew 7, verses 28, all the way to Matthew chapter 8, verse 15. And then under Luke, I want you to write Luke chapter 4, verse 31, all the way to Luke chapter 5, verse 16. Are we together? Column number 2. Under Mark, I want you to write Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 22. And then under Matthew, I want you to write Matthew chapter 9, verses 1 through 17. And then under Luke, I want you to write Luke chapter 5, verses 17 to 39. These are the parallel corresponding material that they share similarity in the Synoptic Gospels. Okay, column number 3, under Mark, write Mark chapter 2, verse 23, all the way to Mark chapter 3, verse 12. Then under Matthew, write Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 16. And then under Luke, Luke chapter 6, verses 1, all the way through Luke chapter 6, verse 11, and verse 17 and 19. Are we together? Yes? Okay. Then number 4, under Mark. So you see we're filling in this grid. Okay, we're filling it in, right? Number 4, Mark chapter 3, verses 13 to 19, and then Matthew chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, and Luke chapter 6, verses 12 to 16. And you'll see, when you study it out, that has similar material going across in the Synoptic Gospels. Then column number 5, Mark chapter 3, verses 20 to 35. On the Matthew chapter 10 verses, Matthew verses chapter 12, Matthew chapter 12 verses 22 to 37. And then on the Luke, write Luke chapter 6 verses 43 to 45. Are we together? Yes? Okay. Now let's look at number 6, column number 6 across the board. Under Mark, you're going to write in there Mark chapter 4, verses 1 through 34. 1 through 34. And then under Matthew, you're going to write Matthew 13, 1 through 34. 1 through 34. And then under Luke, you're going to write chapter 8, verses 4 through 18. Are we together? Yes? Okay. Now let's look at the column number 7. Matthew, Mark, Luke. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So under 7, you're going to put Mark chapter 4, verse 35, all the way through Mark chapter 5, verse 20. So Mark 4:35 all the way to Mark 5:20. Then under Matthew, I want you to write Matthew chapter 8, verses 18 to 34. 18 to 34, and as well as Luke, right? Luke chapter 8, verse 22 to 39. And then Mark, the 8th column would be Mark chapter 5, verse 21 all the way to verse 43. And then under Matthew, on column number 8, right, Matthew chapter 9, verse 18 all the way to verse 26. And then in Luke, I want you to write Luke chapter 8, verses 40 all the way to verse 56. Luke chapter 8, verses 40 to 56. So you should have 3 columns across, Mark, Matthew, Luke, 8 columns down. So under Mark, you'll have 8 columns. Under Matthew, you have 8 columns. Under Luke, you have 8 columns. That, ladies and gentlemen, is basically, okay, a slice of the pie of the synoptic gospels. Okay? So now, one more thing. I want you to also note this, right as a side note on the side there. Matthew, okay, the audience was Jewish. It had a Jewish audience. Mark, it had a Gentile audience. Gentile audience. Luke, okay? So on the Mark, you're going to put Gentile audience and then put Roman. Okay? On the Luke, put Gentile audience and put Greek. And then John just put the world. It was an evangelistic audience, the world. Okay? So those are the 4 perspectives. Okay? Matthew is a Jewish audience. Mark is a Gentile audience, primarily Romans. And then Matthew is primarily, Luke, is primarily a Gentile audience, but primarily Greek. And then John is the world, literally, okay, around the globe, an evangelistic approach. So we're together? So now the book of Mark, what we're going to do is Mark is going to serve as our anchor, as an example with regard to as we look at the synoptic gospels, right? And so I want you to see that. So you have the responsibility now to study out, okay? You're going to be studying, all right, okay, all of this. And then we're going to give some examples. We're just going to follow it through, okay? And Mark is going to be our anchor here. So for the moment, biblical scholars have always concluded that the differences between the synoptic gospels, which include not only the content and the arrangement, but also chronology. Chronology plays a role in the gospels. Significant themes plays a role in the gospels, okay? And theological motifs play a role in the gospels, point to each gospel having its own particular theological emphasis. So we have a theological emphasis in the book of Matthew, we have one in Mark, we have one in Luke, and we have one in John as well. Right? Each gospel was likely written for a different community or communities, plural, of faith at a different time and location to bring the gospel witness to bear on the needs of that particular community. Now the gospel writers selectively edited and arranged the diverse traditions about Jesus that were widespread in the early church. We know that to be true. We know that's very true. Just quickly, go to Luke. Go to Luke chapter 1. Okay? And look with me at the first 3 verses. Luke chapter 1, look at the first 3 verses. All right? We know that to be true because it says here, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those from the beginning, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Look at verse 3. It seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus. So we have here, So what we have theological material, we have chronological material that's laid out for us in Luke purposely. Right? Now, if you go to, for example, to the Gospel of John, in John chapter 21, let's go to John chapter 21, and you were to see at the end of John 21, you look at verse 25, it says, and there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that not even the world itself would not contain the books that would be written. So we see clearly here that the synoptic gospel being seen together, we see distinct perspectives, and they're written in a certain way for a specific purpose. This was not some haphazard, right, concoction that was created. Okay? It has a logic behind each one. The problem is that we're confused as to what the logic is. And that's what we're going to clarify in this introduction. So we have from Luke 1 through John 21, we can see very clearly here to emphasize different aspects of the life of Christ and different aspects of his teachings. Because we had different audiences, different locations at different times with specific needs. That suggests that each gospel has its own unique literary history as well as shares a great deal of the Jesus tradition with others. That's what we would call the synoptic problem, right? Which we're going to study a little bit later on. This is really crucial because you hear so many messages that, particularly out of the Gospels, the synoptic gospel, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that almost seem completely contradictory to the Gospel of John. That's because, again, when you're going to teach and preach out of the synoptic gospels, you need to look at that storyline, that specific storyline in Matthew, in Mark, in Luke, and in John, if it's repeated in John, so you have a proper perspective. Otherwise, you're going to wind up sounding contradictory and confused. So you need to do that very carefully. Do the due diligence. Okay? Stop being lazy. I need you to comprehend that. So, in spite of the many differences that exist in what we would call the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke do share a similar outline in how the storyline unfolds. While each gospel gives the story a particular personality, the synoptics together share a general shape in recounting the events and the significance of Jesus. We can see that the shape in the 8 basic movements to the story. However, we have to keep in mind that these are divisions that help our modern minds follow the story and are really artificial and arbitrary in terms of the narrative itself. So we're going to create some artificial things so that our fine modern mind can understand what is being said to us today. Welcome back. This is Lecture 2, Part 2. Now this is going to be a working class. The next several classes we're going to be working. Get your laptops out, get your tablets out, get your yellow pads out, and we're going to work through the synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke in that specific order for specific reasons. I want you to become extremely familiar with the synoptic gospel because it is the gateway into the New Testament. By this stage, you should have your number of reading assignments already completed, and that would be in Dr. Carson's book. That would be the Synoptic Gospel, pages 77 all the way to page 103, as well as in Dr. Ben Ware's book. You would be reading pages 47 to 61. Keep up with your reading. You need to stay up with your reading. And all of you who have taken my classes know that when it comes to your reading and your test, I am merciless. Right? I have been told that repeatedly. Now, stay with the theme. Let's stay with the theme in this section. The synoptics. It means seen together. seeing all of the stories together from different and distinct points, from distinct vantage points. In this particular theme that we'll be looking at is this: each gospel was likely written for a different community of faith at a different time and location to bring the gospel witness to bear on the needs of that particular community. So what we're going to do is look at 8 sections over the next few classes in this particular lecture series called Part 2. We're going to go through and work through, so you need to get your Bibles, because we're going to work through this and get your pads out, make rooms on your desk, whatever you have to do, and you're going to have to work through this thing. You're going to have to create some boxes, and I want to explain that to you along the way. Before we do that, I want you to note something. We're going to study this in the order of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And the reason we're going to do it in that specific order is because most scholars agree that Mark was probably the first gospel written, and even among that group of the majority, there's a lot of debates. But for our purposes, I want to take it in that order because Mark is the simplest of all of the narratives as compared to Matthew and Luke, and you'll see this in a moment with me. So Mark is listed first because it is the simplest version of the narrative, which most biblical scholars agree. We're going to do 8 sections. Number 1, introduction. And what we're going to do is enter into the introduction of the synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Then I want you to create 3 boxes like we did in our previous class. And on the 3 boxes up on top, you're going to put Mark, Matthew, Luke, and then you're going to create a second box underneath each one of those, and we're going to write in the scriptures for the introduction of the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels. Why? Because the Synoptic Gospels is the gateway into the New Testament, as you will see this a little bit later on, as well as the fact that you need to understand how the Gospels are broken down. You need to understand how they're organized and why they're organized the way they're organized. People read the Gospels and they just walk away either enthralled, inspired, or completely frustrated because they see, well, somebody, this common comment that you'll hear is somebody's confused because this guy says this of this event, this guy says that event, and the guy says another thing about the event. You need to understand what synoptic means. It means seeing it all together. Remember the intersection of that car accident? Remember when I was explaining that to you? You have different perspectives. That's what the synoptic gospels are like. So, number 1, introduction. You got your 3 boxes up there, Mark, Matthew, Luke. Under Mark, I want you to put Mark 1:1. And then under Matthew, I want you to put chapter 1, verse 1, all the way to chapter 2, verse 23. Matthew 1:1. all the way to Matthew 2:23, and then under Luke, I want you to put Luke chapter 1:1 all the way to Luke 2:52. Luke 2:52. Immediately you see a stark difference. These 3 are the introductions to the Synoptic Gospels. You see that Mark is extremely brief, then Matthew, and then the longest of the 3 introductions would be Luke. So in Luke, you will see with me, in Mark, you will also see with me there's some unique things about it. If you go to Mark, just briefly, just write this down, just jot this down quickly. In the parables, of all the parables that Jesus has, Mark has only 2 parables that are unique to Mark. That would be in the healings, in the parables would be the parable of the growing seed, that's Mark chapter 4, verse 26 to 29, as well as the absent householder, that would be Mark chapter 13, verse 33 to 37. Then in the miracles that Jesus, all the miracles that are recorded, there are 2 that are unique to Mark. Number 1 would be the healing of a deaf mute. That would be Mark chapter 7, verse 31. And then you have the healing of a blind man at Bethesda, and that would be Mark chapter 8, verse 22. So let's begin to look at this introduction. Right? And I want you to see the vast differences. Right? the synoptics differ widely in how they begin the gospel narratives. Mark has only one verse introduction that provides no information beyond labeling the gospel as the beginning. You look at Mark and it says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's the entire introduction. That's it. One verse. So in your box you got Mark 1:1. Right? Now you go back with me and you look at Matthew chapter 1. And I want you to see this with me. The introduction changes quite dramatically in Matthew. Now, Matthew has 2 chapters that include an introductory genealogy. Now, these 2 chapters is nothing but introduction. That's all it is. Introduction to the Gospel of Matthew. So in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1 through 17 is the genealogy. Write that down, the genealogy. Then you have Joseph's dream about accepting Mary, right? The birth of Christ. That would be Matthew chapter 1, verse 18 to 25. Then we have the flight. Then we have the visit of the Magi, okay? The wise men. That would be Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Then we have the family's flight to Egypt, where they escaped. That would be verses of 13, 14, and 15. Then we have Herod's murder. He of all the children in Bethlehem, you remember that? That would be Herod's. He kills all the children. This is Herod's murder of the infants in Bethlehem. That would be chapter 2 of Matthew, and that would be verses 16, 17, and 18. Then after that, we have the family's return to Nazareth. And that would be chapter 2, verses 19. They return to Nazareth, verses 19 to 23. So that's the complete introduction to the book of Matthew. Now we get to Luke. Luke here is quite different. And I want to draw your attention to that as well. In Luke, you will see that Luke has a much longer introduction. It goes from Luke 1:1 all the way to Luke chapter 2 to verse 52. So let's break it down in its various components. Luke begins a much longer 2-chapter account with a 4-verse dedication to Theophilus. Now notice with me in Luke chapter 1, and as I've asked you, as you're trying to make yourself comfortable and spread out, I need you to just stay with me. You know, we're going to use a lot of ink here, okay, or we're going to tap away at a lot of keys. We would have here in the introduction, it starts out with the first 4 verses. It is an introduction and a dedication to Theophilus. And as much as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. So this starts out the introduction to the book of Luke. Then after that, he tells us Zachariah's account with an angel in the temple. That would start in verse 5, where the angel announces the birth of John the Baptist. We see this with Zacharias. This starts in verse 5, and it goes all the way down to verse 23. At the end of verse 23 of chapter 1, you can see here where this whole account takes place. Then you have the conception of John the Baptist. This would be verse 24 and 25. Then after that, we have the announcement or the annunciation of Jesus' birth to Mary. If you recall that, Gabriel announces Christ's miraculous birth to Mary. This starts in verse 26, and it goes all the way down and through, it will go all the way down through verse 38, down to verse 38. Then we have the visit of Mary. Mary visits Elizabeth, climaxing with that great song that was called the Magnificat. That really starts in verse 29. You'll see this. Verse 26. You'll see this. And then it goes all the way down to the end of from verse 39 all the way to 56. And if you notice, in verse 46 through 55 is the actual song. It's called the Magnificat, which is rarely ever sung anymore today in the churches, and I'm not even sure why that is that way that is. And then we have the birth of John the Baptist and Zachariah's response, which is the Benedictus. The Elizabeth gives birth to John, and that starts in verse 57, and it goes all the way to verse 79, 80. Okay, you can see that there. Then we have the birth of Jesus. That's chapter 2 of Luke, and that would be verses 1 through 7. And then we have the visit of the shepherds. That would be chapter 2, the angel, where the angel announces Jesus to the shepherds. That starts in verse 8, chapter 2, and that goes all the way through verse 20. Then we have the circumcision of Jesus takes place. He's presented at the temple, and that's in Luke chapter 2, verse 21, all the way to 24. And then we have the prophecies of Simeon and Anna, Simeon's prophecy. That's in verse 25, okay, all the way through verse 38. And then we have the account of Jesus in the temple at the age of 12. And we see this, Jesus' return as well as included in here. And we see this from verses 41, where Jesus celebrates the Passover, all the way through 52 to 52. So now what we have here is under number 1, the introduction is Mark 1:1, Matthew chapter 1, all the way to Matthew chapter 2, verse 23. And then the third column is Luke chapter 1:1, all the way to Luke 2:52. That's the introduction. So you can see that the introduction, it varies widely for the Gospels. Now we're going to do number 2. Put number 2, Jesus' ministry. Draw out your 3 boxes again, and we're going to have Mark, Matthew, Luke in that order. And let me give you some scriptures to fill in there so you understand now which sections just talks about the ministry of Jesus. Number 2, Jesus' ministry. Now, the beginning of Jesus' ministry is very similar in all 3 synoptics. All include the stories of John the Baptist, Jesus' baptism, as well as his temptation, although they differ in specific content and arrangement. You need to comprehend. That's why it's called a synoptic, seen together. Do you follow me? Seen together. So it has specific content and arrangements, and they do differ. They're not confused. They do differ. You remember, like when we're talking about that accident, you go to court and you give that testimony, and you have the northeast, northwest, northeast corner, and you have the southwest and southeast corners, and you're going to have different perspectives of what you see takes place. Well, the synoptics is like that. So let's begin on the Mark. On the Mark, I want you to write in there, Mark chapter 1, verse 2, all the way to 13. Mark 1, 2 through 13. That's the ministry of Jesus in the book of Mark, okay? You're going to see that in there. And then in Matthew, you're going to write under Matthew, you're going to fill in there. You go chapter 3, Matthew chapter 3, verse 1, all the way to Matthew chapter 4, verse 11. That is the entire ministry of Jesus being discussed specifically there. Then you'll have in the book of Luke, in the third column, you're going to write in Luke chapter 3, verse 1, all the way to Luke chapter 4, verse 13. So let's look at some of the details of that. In Mark is typically much shorter, taking only 7 verses to discuss John the Baptist. That would be Mark chapter 1, verse 2 to 8. And then there's 3 verses of Jesus' baptism. That would be Mark chapter 1, verse 9, 10, and 11. Then we would have the presenting of the temptation narrative in only 2 verses. Now, this is key. Mark only talks about the temptation, that Jesus receives in only 2 verses. That's it. It's a very short narrative, right? It omits all kinds of details about the temptation. It just makes it as a statement of fact. That's it. And that would be Mark chapter 1, verse 12 and 13. Then we get to Matthew. Now, Matthew expands the account of John the Baptist, telling us about his appearance as well as the content of his message. That would be Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. Then Matthew adds the deference of John, or the respect of John, to Jesus at the baptism. We see that in Matthew chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. And Matthew also expands on the temptation narrative to include the nature of the 3 temptations with biblical quotations by Jesus from the Old Testament. And this is the most detailed account of the temptation. We see it there, and this will be Matthew chapter 4, verse 1 through 11. Then Luke. Luke follows Matthew closely here, but it adds historical details as well as additional information about the preaching of John the Baptist. And we will see this in Luke chapter 3, verses 10 to 14. And then a genealogy of Jesus is given in Matthew chapter 3, verse 23, all the way to 28. So you can see the beginnings. This is the beginnings of Jesus' ministry, and you see how all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels makes a distinct presentation of them. One states it as a fact, the other ones get into the details. Now, here's your third one. You're going to write up there, number 3, Jesus' Galilean ministry. Jesus' Galilean ministry. Get your 3 boxes up there again, and now we're going to write in there Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and now we're going to do this. In this section, we're going to look at Mark. You write Mark chapter 1, verse 14, all the way to Mark chapter 8, verse 46. This is extensive in Mark, but it's a very simple narrative. Column number 2, put in there Matthew, and you're going to put Matthew chapter 4, verse 12, and you're going to go all the way to Matthew chapter 16, verse 12. You're looking at 12 chapters in Matthew that discusses the Galilean ministry of Jesus. Then in Luke, you're going to write down in Luke, you're going to put Luke chapter 4, verse 14, and you're going to go all the way to Luke chapter 9, verse 17, and then put in parentheses verse 50. So you can see how the synoptics treat the Galilean ministry. So I want you to notice something else that's really key, because this will frustrate you if you don't understand it. By design, I want you to notice the lack of chronology. Okay? There is no chronology. You need to get that out of your head. I know that at least in our culture in the West, we read from left to right, and we assume that because it is from left to right, that it's in chronological order, and it is not. Otherwise, you will be frustrated. That's why when you start studying the New Testament, you really need to get a handle and clear understanding of the Gospels, because it is the gateway into the New Testament. This is the largest section of the Gospels and includes nearly half of the book of Mark and Matthew and slightly less of the book of Luke. This is the meat of the Gospels. There are many geographical markers, but few indications of time. You get a lot of geography, but you don't get a timeline. And that, I think, we in the West, we get frustrated with that. We like everything in sequential order, and the Bible just simply does not afford us that opportunity. So you need to understand them. This, combined with the fact that individual stories are placed in different contexts in the Gospels, means that a reliable chronology of the material is virtually impossible. So stop driving yourself crazy. It's not the timeline, it's the content that is more important. Once again, there is a great deal of difference in how the material is arranged and used. Even those differences, even with all of those differences, there are several features that are shared by all three of the Gospels. So there are four things that we want to go into. A, while they're all arranged differently, the teachings of Jesus themselves figure prominently in this section of the synoptics. So that's what really we need to focus on. We need to concentrate on the actual teachings, excuse me, rather than getting caught up as to when he taught what. You see, don't get caught up on the timeline. You need to focus on what he actually said. And this drives people nuts all the time. You need to get past the chronology idea. That's the number one complaint that you hear all the time is, but when did he do this? When did he do that? Right? Forget that. It's not given to us. This includes the sayings associated with the miracles as responses to people and circumstances, the teachings in the parables of this way, the teachings directed to the 12 disciples, as well as a larger group of followers and the crowds in general. So you have no chronology in this. B, the calling of the 12, their commissioning. The various narratives surrounding them are all included in all three synoptics, but we're not given a whole lot of information as to when that happens. C, most of the miracle stories of the Gospels are in this particular section. That's when the majority are. Most of the miracles are here. Right? If you look at Mark chapter 1, you look at verse 14 to all the way to Mark chapter 8, verse 26. In Mark alone, that's where all the miracles take place. In Matthew chapter 4, you'll look at verse 12 all the way to Matthew chapter 16, verse 12. That's where all the miracles are in Matthew. And then in Luke chapter 4, verse 14, all the way to Luke chapter 9, verse 17. Welcome back to our class. This will be lecture 2, part 3, and we're going to pick up where we left off talking and just having the discussion about the Galilean ministry. If you remember, you should have your 3 boxes up there. On the Mark, it will be Mark chapter 1, verse 14, all the way to Mark chapter 8, verse 26. And then on the Matthew, you would have Mark chapter 4, verse 12, all the way to Matthew chapter 16, verse 12. And then on the Luke, you would have Luke chapter 4, verse 14, all the way to chapter 9, verse 17, and then in parentheses, I want you to put in there verse 50 as well. So we're talking about, remember we did point A, point B, and then we started to get into part of point C in our last class when time ran out. And so we're looking at this. Let's just go back there real quickly. Point C. Most of the miracle stories of the Gospels are written in this section. This is where the majority of the miracles are recorded in the Gospels. Mark chapter 1, verse 14, all the way to Mark chapter 8, verse 26. In Matthew chapter 4, verse 12, all the way to Matthew chapter 16, verse 12. As well as in Luke chapter 4, verse 14, all the way to Luke chapter 9, verse 17. Most of the Gospels, most of the miracle stories of the Gospels are, in fact, in this section. About 10 of these occur in all 3 Gospels. Although they are given different contexts and points of emphasis. This is really crucial. They're given different emphasis, okay? Points of emphasis, and that, I think, because we don't understand that, that's by design, okay? And they're given to us in different contexts as well. And I want you to, there are other accounts that occur in only 1 or 2 of the synoptics, but by and large, that's the majority of them. I want you to see that. So if we were looking at the miracles, for example, if we're going to look at all the miracles that took place, you would see that they would be quite unique to the Gospels. And you need to understand that it's by design that we see that. And I think what happens is that people just get frustrated because they can't see that we're looking for chronology. That's what we're doing. We're looking for chronology, and really chronology doesn't ever really come to us. It's never really presented to us in such a way. If you were to look at, for example, the miracles of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the ones that are unique to him. In Matthew, it would be the healing of the two blind men in Matthew 9:27. In the curing of a demon-possessed mute man, that would be Matthew 9:32. That's pretty unique to Matthew, those particular miracles that took place. You were looking at Mark, it would be the healing of a deaf mute. That would be Mark chapter 7, verse 31. And the healing of a blind man at Bethesda, that would be Mark chapter 8, verse 22. And then if we were going to look at the miracles of Jesus that are unique to Luke, then we have much more there. We have quite a number there. And that would be... let's see, that would be the escape from the hostile multitude. Remember that? That's in Luke 4:30. The catching of the fish, that's in Luke 5:1. The raising of the widow's son, in Nain, that would be Luke 7:11. The healing of the afflicted, the bent woman, she was bent over. Remember that? That's Luke chapter 13, verse 11. The healing of the man with dropsy, that would be in Luke 14:1. The cleansing of the 10 leopards, that's in Luke 17:11. The restoring of the servant's ear, you remember that? That's Luke 22, verse 51. So you see that each one has different things that are unique to it. And then the rest of the majority of the miracles are shared and woven through all three Gospels. But as I said, within different contexts and with different points of emphasis. That's really crucial to understand that. Then point D, hostility. Hostility and opposition from various representatives of Judaism to Jesus is interwoven in the various ways throughout all of the narratives, particularly in Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Jesus' interaction with the traditions of Judaism and his perspective on observance of the law creates oppositions to his teachings and his ministry. Now, so let's look at this a little bit more in detail. Mark. Under Mark tends to follow a more straightforward narrative style in which incidents are connected with verbs of movements and places names. Okay? It's just a straightforward presentation. It gives us just the facts, right through. The teachings and the sayings of Jesus occur in occasional settings scattered throughout the narrative. There are fewer parables that are discussed. We know that in Mark than in the other two synoptics. We know that to be true. If I was looking at, for example, Luke, has a distinct order of them, much different than, let's say, than Matthew does or Mark does. So we have quite a number of differences that are laid out for us. You would see, for example, there are two major parables, okay, to Mark. That would be Mark chapter 4. Okay? You see the two major parables that are there. The sower, remember that? In Mark chapter, in fact, just go there just briefly. Mark chapter 4, you will see that in verses 1 through 9. The parable of the soils, the parable of the sower. That parable is extensive there. And then in verses 14 to 20, it's followed through again in that particular parable of the sower. And then you have the parable of the tenants. That's unique to Mark. You will see that in Mark chapter 12. If you go to Mark all the way to chapter 12 there as well. So I want you to just write down Mark chapter 12 there for the parable there of the tenants. And that would be verses 1 through 12. 1 through 12. Where there's this whole discussion, if you remember, of the vineyard and the owner and all that's taking place, along with a very short explanation of the purposes of the parables. You do see that. And that's in Mark chapter 4, if you remember that. In verses 10 to 11, there's like this. It breaks up the parable of the soils. Just look at that. In Mark chapter 4, verse 10 through 12. We know the first part of this parable is discussed in verses 1 through 9. Then this is kind of this break, this dialogue takes place in verse 10 through 12. And it says this: as soon as he was alone, his followers along with the 12 began asking him about the parables. And he was saying to them, to you has been given the mystery of the kingdom of God, but to those who are outside get everything in parables, so that while seeing they may see and not perceive, and while hearing they may hear and not understand. Otherwise they might be turned to be forgiven. So, here's an incredible mystery about the parables that is being discussed here, and the class is not designed to get into that particular discussion at the moment, so I'm not going to get into the details of that. And so I want you to see that there's a short explanation of the parables, and it serves to call hearers to respond. That's basically the gist of that right there for the moment. Then we go to Matthew. And we begin to see also some other things about Matthew as well. Now, Matthew expands this section by collecting together in blocks of material the sayings and the teachings of Jesus that are in other contexts, such as in Mark and such as in Luke. But it just blocks it in large portions. That's the reason why this section would be Matthew chapter 4, verse 12, all the way to Matthew chapter 16, verse 12. Now, the largest of this section is the Sermon on the Mount. That will be Matthew chapter 5, Matthew chapter 6, Matthew chapter 7. Those three need to be studied together, as well as the mission of the 12. We see this in Matthew chapter 10. Quite extensive, and the parables of the kingdom are quite extensive in Matthew chapter 13. Miracle stories also tend to be clustered together following the Sermon on the Mount, and the controversies tend to dominate the later chapters of the book of Matthew. Then briefly over to the book of Luke. Introduces the theme of Jesus' mission at the beginning of this section. We see that in Luke chapter 4, verse 16, chapter 4, verses 16, all the way to verse 30, you see the whole beginning of his ministry, his mission in particular, and then arranges all of the events and the teachings and the healings to demonstrate the outworking of that mission. So that's how it's ordered. You remember the introduction that Luke did to Theophilus, right? And he said that he was going to give it to them in consecutive order. Luke is the only one who does it in consecutive order. He's the only one. So if you're going to work on some kind of a chronology, some kind of a sequential order, Luke is your best bet for trying to figure out what happened when and in what order. So we see that. Luke also has much shorter blocks of teaching material than in Matthew. Matthew has the largest portion of the teaching materials, often with different settings. But not located, now by not locating the following sections, if you were to look at Luke chapter 9, verse 18 to 36, you would see at Caesarea Philippi, Luke effectively extends the Galilean ministry. He extends the Galilean ministry all the way to verse 50. That's the reason why, remember when I told you in your blocks, in your 3 blocks, you put Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and I told you that in Mark, I want you to write in there Mark chapter 4, verse 14, all the way to Luke chapter 9, from Luke chapter 4, verse 14 to Luke chapter 9, all the way to verse 17. Then I said, in parentheses, put verse 50. Remember that? It was for that particular reason. Now let's go to number 4. We're going to call this, number 4, we're going to call this the turning point. The turning point. Get your 3 boxes back up there, and let's look at Mark, Matthew, and Luke. We're going to call number 4 the turning point. When the ministry really turns, here's where now takes a big change here. So in the first box, we're going to put Mark chapter 8, verse 27, all the way to Mark chapter 9, verse 8. And then in the second box, Matthew, underneath, I want you to put Matthew chapter 16, Matthew chapter 16, verse 13, all the way to Matthew 17, 8. Chapter 17, verse 8. And then in Luke, I want you to write in Luke chapter 9, verse 18 to 36. We're going to call this section, number 4, the turning point. In different ways, all 3 gospel uses Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus' response with the first prediction of his impending suffering and death, the Passion, what we call Passion Week, to mark a turning point in Jesus' ministry. This is really crucial because now he begins to announce his death. This is why we call it the turning point. Before this, much of Jesus' ministry was public, accompanied and acclaimed by crowds of followers. All this time, you have huge crowds following him. After this, Jesus is much more reclusive, spending more time with the disciples themselves and in prayer, and is not as willing to perform spectacular miracles any longer. The references to his coming death are accompanied by teachings specifically on discipleship. You can see how now the gospel narratives begin to change here at this point. This section also includes the account of the transfiguration that is almost identical in all three gospels. So in this way, three major themes of the gospels are in fact highlighted. Number one, the confession of Jesus as the Christ. Remember that? Because that's the word in Greek, and then in the Hebrew it would be the Messiah, the Messiah. Number two, the suffering of Jesus and his relationship to following Jesus in discipleship. That becomes a major theme. And then number three, the hidden glory of Jesus seen only through the eyes of faith. The eyes of faith. So those are the three major themes that really flow through the Synoptic Gospels from this point forward, after what we would call the turning. Mark presents the disciples, represented by Peter, as confused and not really comprehending his teachings or believing his predictions about suffering and death. Jesus has harsh words for Peter. Remember that? In Mark chapter 8, if you recall, in Mark chapter 8, Jesus really spoke harshly to him at that one moment in chapter 8. And look with me over there in verse 33. Jesus said, but turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but on man's. And after Peter rebukes him for talking about his death. Now you begin seeing the tone, and he moves away from a public ministry more into a private discipleship ministry. In Matthew's account, version is only slightly longer and presents the disciples in a better light in Matthew. Only Matthew tells of Jesus first responding positively to Peter's confession, blessing him by using a word play on his name, rock. Remember that? If you go to Matthew chapter 16, for example, and we go down there to verse 17, 18, and 19, it says this. Simon Peter answered, well, let's back up to verse 15. And he said to them, but who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said to him, blessed you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth, you shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. So we have in this particular account a more positive presentation of Peter. And Luke, now Luke is different. Luke does not locate the confession of Peter at Caesarea Philippi. He doesn't do that. He leaves it and the following events of part of Jesus' Galilee ministry and places it much earlier. He actually places it much earlier than Matthew does. Luke omits Peter's rebuke and Jesus' stern response. So you can begin to see why we call it the synoptics. We call it the synoptics because it's seeing it together. And if you recall in our earlier discussion about the theme of this particular section is that each gospel was likely written for a different community of faith at a different time and location to bring the gospel witness to bear on the needs of that particular community. So you can see that Jesus is in fact moving around in his ministry, and there is different locations, so different emphasis, different reasons as to why things are recorded or registered, written in the way that they are. Now, I want you to look at number 5, point number 5, the journey toward Jerusalem. Now we go from moving from number 4, the turning point, and now he makes that final turn. Point number 5 is the journey to Jerusalem. Mark, Matthew, Luke. Remember the 3 boxes. So point number 5, write down the journey toward Jerusalem, and then do your 3 boxes again across the board. Mark, Matthew, Luke, and then on the mark, I want you to write Mark chapter 9, verse 9, all the way to chapter 10, verse 52. Mark 9:9 all the way to Mark 10:52. Then on the Matthew, I want you to write in Matthew 17:9, 17 verse 9, all the way to Matthew chapter 20, verse 34. And then in Luke, I want you to write down Luke chapter 9, verse 37, all the way to Luke chapter 19, verse 27. So you can already see the vast differences. As we look at this section, Mark and Matthew are very similar in this section, while Luke is considerably different. Basically, all 3 chart a steady movement from Galilee to Jerusalem. Mark especially includes geographical references that help plot the movement of the story toward Jerusalem. This is how we know where he was at each event, because Mark gives us the geographical locations. But since there are a few time references, the chronology in John's gospel is considerably different. We know that. It is uncertain whether this journey is a physical one or a literary technique in which several trips are given to us in an outline form or schematized. So I want you to understand that. In addition, all 3 gospels include the ironic account of the disciples arguing over who is the greatest and seeking positions of honor. And when Jesus comes into his kingdom, in spite of Jesus' continued predictions of his coming death, they were arguing about who was going to be the next big cheese in the group. Then the book of Mark is once again the simplest version of all the narratives. And I think that really, if you wanted to get, if you're going to be one of those lazy Christians like so many are, you just go through the book of Mark and try to get a grasp of the Gospels. But that would be quite deceiving, since he has a simple version. He has what we would call the Reader's Digest version, or better yet, Mark is the book for dummies of the Gospel. So we will look at that. So I want you to see this with me. Mark is in fact the simplest version. A narrative with almost everything in Mark also included in the 2 other synoptics. In terms of the rhetorical structure of the book of Mark, you would see it quite distinct in Mark chapter 8, verse 1, all the way through to Mark chapter 10, verse 52, form a larger narrative unit centering on the themes of discipleship. This is where the heart of it is found. It's in discipleship. Is going to be in this section, and all of its understanding and what it costs to be a disciple. In this section, the theme of discipleship is stressed, as well as the examples that you're going to get here in Mark of faith that illustrate the nature of the kingdom of God, because this is where we get that section where he talks about all of the nature of the kingdom of God. So you can begin to see, as we see all of the distinct structures that are found in the Gospels and the Synoptics, which is really the gateway to the New Testament. Because remember, the epistles are explained to us from the perspective of the apostles, what they heard and saw being taught in the presence of Jesus. And so that's the reason why, if you just go into the epistles and ignore the Gospels, first of all, you're going to have a misunderstanding, and second, you're going to have a misapplication of those truths. Right? So that's going to happen. So that's the reason why in the study of the New Testament, what we're doing is we're taking the time now to do just a very brief walkthrough of the Synoptic Gospels, because later on as we get into the epistles, you're going to find out that a lot that's being quoted you haven't understood its context in. And so that's crucial for us. Then Matthew, take Matthew's position is quite different from Mark and Luke, and I want to draw your attention to that as well.